if you think of the powers that control, we've been through a 500-year cycle of colonization, and I see what's happening today as recolonization. I defined free trade and WTO and NAFTA as recolonization. And in that period of neoliberal globalization, it went hand in hand with IMF and World Bank imposing structural adjustments. And IMF said, you've got to apply this like a guillotine, because if you give time, people will react and not allow it to happen. So every IMF conditionality and World Bank conditionality was a guillotine. In India, we responded to the 1990 guillotine, and for 30 years, farmers have been protesting in this country, and those protests continue. I'm sure the news of the Indian protests reach you, but these are 30-year-old protests. And then if you take them back in history, they're 400-year protests. So the guillotine is the way democracy is killed. Because if people can think and people can organize, they will respond. And response is the one thing surveillance capitalism does not want. And when you talked about the death of investigative journalism, when all the news is in the hands of the digital giants, it takes nothing to decide what will go off YouTube, what will go off Facebook, what will go off Twitter. And the fascinating issue is the more they destroy community, they say, the community rules do not allow, billionaire surveillance states do not allow, but they call themselves community. They take our words.
Yeah, it's all from a completely, sort of uninvolved, disconnected perspective. Sometimes it's almost impressive how diabolical it is. And again, almost makes it harder to convince people of that. You're not unfamiliar, though, with, let's say, David and Goliath type scenarios, famously taking on, the sort of nameless, faceless, embodiment of corporate darkness, Monsanto for many years, and ultimately being victorious in that long, I would say, arduous and no doubt quite difficult aspect of taking on that sort of entity that had all the ability to be as litigious as it needed to be, et cetera. So we find ourselves now, at least from my perspective, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, that it's almost like a rethinking of a strategy. Okay, well, wait a sec. The corporations to some degree might have a little tinge on them. And Monsanto, of course, is a brand to the point where they have actually rebranded. Would maybe not be the right group and the right way and the right strategy to move the agenda forward. So let's pivot towards philanthropy. And now we've gone again from that sort of nameless, faceless multinational to, well, I would argue a Bond villain or Bond villains. But it almost seems like a diabolically clever strategy to say, well, if we can achieve the same agenda, but under the guise of philanthropy, not only will we not be resisted, we'll be supported. Is that what's happened here in the recent years?
Absolutely. And I noticed this, Richard, in the 2015 climate discussions in Paris. Now, I've been involved in the UN process of environmental laws, beginning with the lead up to the Earth Summit in 1992. I participated with my government and advisor to many governments in both the framing of the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect species on Earth. And that's where we put in the laws for biosafety to regulate GMOs, because I had woken up to the Monsantos in '87. And so the Earth Summit happened after my wake up. And then there was the climate UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically between countries. But because the rich industrialized countries had become rich on the backs of slavery and colonization and coal and oil, quite clearly the restrictions and limits on emissions were to be put on them. In Copenhagen, these rules and laws were dismantled. And the 5 big polluters were brought together by President Obama, who was seen as a very big savior of the planet. And he basically brought the polluters together and said, let's have voluntary commitment. Why have binding laws? And then you had Paris, and everyone thinks there was no climate treaty before Paris, when Paris is really the non-treaty negotiations of voluntary commitments of polluters. And who's standing on the stage? And who's giving the recipes? With the heads of state in the center is Bill Gates. And I said, something has shifted. And instead of negotiations of one country, one vote, and the island nations and the mountain countries from the Himalaya, the Saharas, instead of the worst victims of climate change who were leading the negotiations till then, the tech giants start to read, and Zuckerberg was there and Gates was there. And what were they offering? Gates was offering more fossil fuels, more fertilizers, geoengineering. If we've messed up the climate with side effects of fossil fuels, now let's totally manipulate the climate and create pollution in the sky and put clouds to block the sun, put iron filings in the ocean. And I'm so glad the Sami have just stopped a geoengineering experiment, which shows the power of the people against these anonymous figures. And of course, genetic engineering. So I started then to research, and my son helped me a lot. And my book called Oneness versus 1%, which has come out from Chelsea Green, is really about my understanding of this shift. And you're so right. The new colonizers are the Philanthro-Imperialists. And they confuse the people, not just with, oh, we are giving, when all they're doing is grabbing. We have a report called Gates to a Global Empire. I've just done a new report on Reclaim the Seed, how even the seeds of the world are now in Gates' hands.